Welcome to this special episode of the Wake Up with Gratitude podcast. I'm your host, Julie Boyer, and we're in week 2 of 30 ways to practice gratitude for the month of November. For those in the US, November is traditionally known as the month of gratitude, so I thought I'd share a simple way to practice gratitude every day. If you're just joining us now, you can head back and listen to day 1 and catch up easily, as each episode is only about 5 minutes long. It's easy to join in. Simply click on subscribe or follow the podcast. That way you'll be alerted every time a new episode is released. That makes it easy to start your day with gratitude and find time to implement the gratitude practice that I've suggested each day. Let's get started with today's gratitude practice. Welcome, friends, to day 15, which means we are halfway through our 30 ways to practice gratitude in the month of November. How are you doing so far? Have you been able to implement some of the things that you've learned in the podcast? I believe that even after just a few short weeks, our gratitude practices can make a difference in how we're feeling every day. Have you thought about inviting a friend to join you for the second half of this challenge? You can send them a link to this podcast directly or post on social media inviting your followers to listen in for the next 15 days. And now that you're halfway through, I thought I'd bring up something that's a little bit more difficult when we talk about gratitude. And that is how gratitude and grief fit together. It may sound like these two things do not belong in the same sentence, but I like to say that gratitude and grief live in the same house. There are many ways that I think about gratitude and grief together. One way is that when I'm going through a difficult time or a feeling of loss, it helps me to find one thing in that day to be grateful for. Not for the grief, not for the loss, but just a moment of perhaps sunshine through a window, or being able to get out of bed, or turning on a faucet with clean, cool water to drink. It can be hard when we are in a period of grief or loss to find any gratitude at all. What I've learned is that when we have gratitude practices that have been established over time, when we get to these periods of difficulty, it is much easier to rely on our practices to help us get through these times than if we don't practice gratitude when things are going well. My daughter is 12 years old, and I'm so grateful that she is happy and healthy and that we have a child. As someone who suffered from endometriosis for 30 years, having a child at all is a miracle. And when I got pregnant for a second time, I was so thrilled that we would be adding a second child to our family. I had passed the end of the first trimester, and I thought that everything was going to be okay. But at 15 weeks gestation, I experienced a traumatic miscarriage at home. My body went into labor, and I gave birth. I was taken to hospital by ambulance, and less than a few hours later, I was in surgery as it had been an incomplete miscarriage. We left the hospital less than 4 hours after I had arrived and went to pick up my daughter at daycare, as if nothing had happened. That night, I found a way to write in my gratitude journal. I wrote that I was grateful that my daughter had been at daycare. I wrote that I was grateful that the police had been able to break down my door. And I was grateful that my husband and one of my best friends were at the hospital with me. You see, I'd been practicing gratitude for over a year at that time, and I never planned to go through something so difficult. But it was my gratitude practice that evening that helped me to get through that one night. And the same practice supported me as I healed from this loss. I believe that our gratitude practices are central to how we deal with grief and loss. And what I invite you to do today is to look back at a period of time of loss or trauma in your life and ask yourself, is there a moment of gratitude that I can find from this time in my life? Looking back at that loss, I grieve the loss of the child that never came to this earth and lived, and I am grateful that we are a family with one child. Our lives would be very different if we had 2 children, and I love being the parent of a single child. If you are going through a difficult period of grief or loss right now, what I invite you to do today is find a small moment of gratitude. As I mentioned earlier, it can be as simple as the light shining through a window, or being able to walk from your bed to the washroom, or that you have a phone or a device to be listening to this podcast on. It's not about minimizing or letting go of our grief. It's about holding both at the same time, allowing in a moment of gratitude to pierce through the grief. And eventually, hopefully, time will help that wound to close. And it will never disappear. The scar will always be there. But there will be moments of gratitude connected to that difficult time. And I know that sometimes I have moments of flashback of that trauma. It's painful, it's difficult, and I can also see gratitude. Gratitude enveloping me in the way that I dealt with the loss, and gratitude for how our lives have unfolded since then. This is not an easy thing for many people, and that's okay if you skip today. But maybe the messages that I shared today will be something that you will need in the future. And hopefully you'll start your gratitude practice today while things are going well, so that when the hard times come, when the losses come, you'll have this practice to help you get through it. This concludes today's gratitude practice. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you take a moment to implement something you've learned today. I have a favor to ask. Would you mind rating and reviewing this podcast? It doesn't matter which podcast app you're using. Every rating helps other people to find this podcast and help them make their decision when choosing which podcast to listen to. I appreciate your support, friends, and I appreciate your support, friends, and thanks so much for taking the time to listen and rating the podcast. I'll be back tomorrow with another way to practice gratitude.